often ask me, is selling your home subject to worth it? In this video, I want to talk a little bit about what subject to is and if it's worth it as a VA seller on whether it's worth it to sell your house in subject to. This is a topic that comes up a lot in our Veteran VA community. I've been a part of Veteran VA for several years now. Chris Griffith, the founder of Veteran VA, started a whole discussion yesterday on Facebook about this. And I felt that is just something that's very important that needs to be discussed because most veterans have no clue about this, that they're getting into some situations they shouldn't be getting into. Oftentimes these investors think they know what they're talking about, don't know what they're talking about either. And so it's a clueless leading the clueless. And I don't think it's intentional, but there's a lot of things you need to understand here. So first of all, what is subject to anyway? So subject to is a type of assumption. It is different from a traditional assumption. So first of all, we need to talk about what subject to is versus a traditional VA assumption. A traditional VA assumption is allowed on every VA home loan. It's literally in your paperwork, and that's done with the lender. Now we're seeing a lot more of these right now because we've got these 2 and 3% rates out there from 4 years ago. That nowadays getting a regular loan is a 6-ish. So people are like, okay, well, gee, I can assume this loan that's at 2 or 3% versus 6, and well, it's a better deal, right? And so in a traditional assumption, the buyer takes over your payments. And they need to qualify. They actually have to go through the entire qualification process as if they start from scratch. Most importantly, it goes on the buyer's credit, not your credit. And entitlement transfers over if the buyer is a veteran. Subject to has none of this. Subject to is simply the buyer taking over title to your house. You have the mortgage. And so, as you might imagine, there's a lot of risks involved in that. And so, first thing I want to say is, if you are the seller and you have other ways to sell your house, then that's a much better way to do it. Next thing to know is it actually breaks the lender's terms of service. People don't realize this, but on a mortgage, there is something called the due on sale clause. What the due on sale clause says is the lender has the right to call the loan due if the house is sold. That's in every loan's terms of service. Now, what investors will tell you, and I've taken a lot of investor seminars, don't get me wrong, that, well, it's not really called that often, so it doesn't really count. Well, just because it didn't call it often doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Now, it is true that if the lender's getting payments on time, they don't want to call loans due. Why would you call the loan due if you're getting paid, right? But it breaks the terms of service. And whose credit's going to go on? Here's the thing. The mortgage stays on your credit. There's a lot of, well, what ifs? What if this investor pays it on time? What if they don't pay it on time? Here's the deal. It stays on your credit, and you have no control over that. If the investor's late, which sometimes they are, it affects your credit score. Not theirs, it affects your credit score. Do you want to take that kind of risk? I say for a lot of people, you shouldn't. Here's the other thing to understand is entitlement also stays with you. It doesn't move over. It stays with you, which could affect how much you can purchase in the next home because we have to consider entitlement. Now, entitlement limits are pretty high, and it does depend on how much you're buying, but it could affect how much you get on the next house. Here's the other thing that people don't consider is considered what's called a contingent liability. Now, you might be saying, wow, what's a contingent liability? That's kind of like when you co-sign a debt for your child, where technically, even though they are paying it, it still goes against you. And we have to count that for 12 months. That's a VA guideline that we have to count that debt for 12 months. So if you're trying to buy a house in the next 12 months, think about it. You have a contingent liability and you have to count both mortgage payments. People don't realize that one. We can't count rent against it because you're not renting it to them. You sold the house and they're taking your payments. It's different than renting out your house. And honestly, it's much better to just sell your house through traditional means. And so that's what I would say or advise is if you're not in any sort of financial crisis, just go with a realtor and do it normally. Now, are there situations where subject to makes sense? There actually are a few. Limited situations where subject to makes sense. And I'm going to go through those now. Typically, the best time to do a subject to as the seller is in a pre-foreclosure situation. Now, if you're in a pre-foreclosure situation, I feel bad for you, and hopefully you can get out of it. But things happen. Life happens. And there are other options available to you. Don't think that you have to do subject to because that's your only means. People don't realize how many options. If you're in a pre-foreclosure situation, the first thing to do is call the VA. They have a service center. They have people that can help. There's whole departments that are available to help you in a pre-foreclosure situation. Next, call the lender. Never hide it. Now, if you're currently close to sheriff's sale, maybe you call the lender. Maybe you call the VA. And the sheriff's beating on your door and you know that this thing's gonna be sold in the next 30 days and you're freaking out, subject to might be a better deal because you wouldn't have that 2-year waiting period. If you have a foreclosure on your credit, you have that 2-year waiting period, your entitlement's tied up, it's a mess. But it should be your last resort. Let me repeat that. It should be your last resort if you're in an emergency financial crisis, not your first choice. And that's where I'm seeing a lot of problems. I'm getting very, very concerned. And Chris was absolutely right. We need to talk about this more often. So there you go. So those are the risks of subject to. I hope this helped. As always, if you have any questions about VA loans or anything in particular, feel free to give me a call. My number is 937-572-3713 or scarpero.com. Talk to you soon. Bye.